The ballroom lights flickered once, then steadied, and nobody in that room noticed except Kieran Locke. He stood near the translation booth at the edge of the gala, headset resting around his neck, watching two men in tailored suits argue in Italian, while a third tried to keep up in broken English. Nobody had asked him to step in yet. Nobody would, unless things fell apart. That was the job. Stay invisible until you're needed, then disappear again the moment the crisis ends. Kieran had learned that skill before he learned to ride a bike. 26 years old, no pack, no family name worth mentioning, he built a quiet reputation as the best multilingual interpreter in Chicago's underground circuit. 6 languages? Perfect memory for phrasing. The kind of person powerful men hired and then forgot existed. Tonight, 500 of the most dangerous people on the East Coast filled a ballroom dressed up as a charity gala, and Kieran was the only Omega in the building without a title, an escort, or a seat at any table that mattered. HI viewers, if you walked into a room where everyone assumed you were worthless, but you knew you were the only one who could save it, would you speak up, or wait for them to find out the hard way? If you're enjoying this story, subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what happens next. The argument at the center table grew louder. Someone slammed a hand on the linen cloth, rattling a row of champagne flutes. A translator working for the Moretti family had misread a single clause in the territory agreement, and now 2 rival organizations believed the other had tried to steal 3 city blocks that neither side actually owned. Chairs scraped back. Men reached toward their jackets out of habit, not thought. Kieran set down his water glass and walked over before he'd fully decided to. "The clause doesn't transfer ownership," he said, loud enough to cut through the shouting but calm enough that 3 heads turned instead of 10. "It transfers management rights for 18 months, pending review. Whoever translated this for you skipped the conditional tense." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when nobody expected the person speaking to be right. An older man in a gray suit, Kieran didn't know his name yet, though he would soon wish he'd learned it sooner, squinted across the table. "Who let the help start negotiating?" Laughter rippled through a cluster of young alpha heirs standing near the bar, all sharp jawlines and expensive watches, all clearly bored until this moment gave them something to laugh at. "He's not negotiating," one of them said, swirling his drink. "He's an Omega who wandered too far from the coat check." Kieran didn't flinch. He'd been called worse by people who mattered less. He reached for the printed agreement, sitting between the 2 furious men, scanned it once more, and pointed to a line near the bottom. "Right here. Section 4. It was never about the land. It's about who collects rent during construction. If you 2 go to war over this, you'll be fighting over a clause a lawyer wrote wrong at 2 in the morning." Silence again. Longer this time. The man from the Moretti side picked up the document, read the section twice, and set it down slowly. Some of the color came back into his face. He's right. Across the room, near the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a man in a dark suit had gone very still. Red DaCosta didn't often watch people twice. Once was usually enough to categorize them: useful, dangerous, irrelevant. But something about the Omega who just talked 2 crime families out of a bloodbath made him set down his glass and actually pay attention. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply watched, the way a man studies a hand of cards he hadn't expected to be dealt. An elderly accountant near the dessert table went pale and set down his fork. His eyes were fixed on Kieran's face like he'd seen a ghost standing in a rented tuxedo. "That's her name," the old man whispered to no one, gripping the edge of the table. "Locke. That can't be." He never finished the sentence. Because at that exact moment, the chandeliers above the ballroom dimmed, flickered twice, and went completely dark. Screams didn't come first. Confusion did. 500 people froze in the dark, waiting for someone to explain what had happened, the way people always do in the half-second before they understand they should be afraid. Kieran didn't wait. He'd already memorized the layout of the room, exits, pillars, the location of every security guard, the moment he walked in. Old habit. The kind you develop when you grow up moving between foster placements and learn that knowing the room could save your life. A hand grabbed his elbow in the dark. "Don't move," a low voice said near his ear. He recognized it instantly, though he never heard it up close. Red DaCosta's voice carried weight even at a whisper, the kind of calm that came from a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I wasn't planning to run into a table," Kieran said. A pause. Almost a laugh, though it never fully arrived. The lights came back 30 seconds later, and the ballroom exhaled. A technician near the stage apologized loudly about a blown breaker. Most of the guests returned to their drinks like nothing had happened. Kieran noticed two things nobody else seemed to. First, the breaker panel was on the opposite side of the building from where the lights had failed. Second, a security guard near the east exit had raised a phone and taken a photograph, not of the chaos, not of the crowd. Of him. He filed both facts away and said nothing. For the rest of the evening, Kieran kept working the way he always did, quietly fixing small disasters before anyone noticed there'd been a disaster at all. A misfiled donation record here. A mistranslated toast there. Each fix small enough to go unnoticed by the room, but not by the one man still watching from across the ballroom. Red DaCosta had built an empire by knowing which details mattered. He'd learned that loud men made noise, and quiet men made decisions. Every time Kieran solved a problem, he did it without looking for credit, without lingering to be thanked. He simply moved on to the next fire before anyone realized there'd been one. That kind of discipline wasn't taught. It was earned the hard way, usually by people the world had already tried to break. Near midnight, Kieran found himself alone in a side hallway lined with framed photographs from past galas, reviewing a stack of donation records the charities board had asked him to organize as a favor. He wasn't looking for anything. He was simply doing what he always did, being useful, staying quiet, staying employed. That was when the numbers stopped adding up. A shelter fund for abandoned Omega youth had received $4 million over the past 3 years, according to the gala's public reports. The shelter's actual operating budget, listed in a separate ledger someone had carelessly left in the same folder, showed less than $600,000. Kieran read the figures twice, then a third time, doing the subtraction in his head the way he did everything, quietly, quickly, without needing a calculator or an audience. Someone had been skimming money meant for kids who grew up exactly like him. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't call attention to it. He photographed the pages with his phone, memorized the account numbers out of habit, and slid the folder back exactly where he'd found it. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a bookkeeping error. And the people responsible for it were almost certainly standing in the ballroom right now, holding champagne glasses and pretending to care about the children they were stealing from. He was halfway back to the main hall when a hand closed around his arm again. Not gentle this time. "You're not supposed to be back here," the security guard from earlier said, his grip tightening. Kieran kept his voice even. "I was returning a folder. Save it." The guard's radio crackled, and he glanced over his shoulder like he was checking for permission. "Boss wants you held until he's ready to talk to you." "Which boss?" The guard didn't answer. He didn't need to. Somewhere behind the closed doors of the ballroom, a voice Kieran didn't recognize spoke into a phone, low and certain, the kind of voice used to giving orders without ever raising it. "Don't let him leave tonight." The guard's grip loosened only when a second man rounded the corner, and Kieran recognized the tailored shoulders before he saw the face. Red DaCosta didn't look at the guard. He looked at Kieran, and something in his expression made the guard release his arm and take a step back without being told twice. "He's fine," Red said. Go check the east hallway. The guard left without a word. That was the kind of authority some men were born believing they deserved and others earned by never once needing to prove it twice. Rhett belonged to the second category. You heard that, Brett said once they were alone. It wasn't a question. I hear a lot of things I'm not supposed to. Kieran straightened his sleeve where the guard had grabbed it. Comes with the job. And what did you hear tonight? Kieran studied him for a moment. Up close, Rhett DaCosta looked less like the stories people whispered about him, less myth, more man. Tired around the eyes in a way power rarely allowed people to show in public. But his attention never wavered, never drifted, the way most powerful men's did when they talked to someone they'd already decided didn't matter. Someone doesn't want me leaving this building, Kieran said. I'd like to know why before I decide how worried to be. So would I. That surprised him more than the blackout had. Before either of them could say more, raised voices spilled out from the ballroom doors. The territorial dispute Kieran had defused earlier had reignited, this time over a second clause nobody had bothered translating carefully. Two men were shouting in different languages, each certain the other was lying, each one closer to reaching for something under his jacket than either seemed to realize. Kieran didn't ask permission. He walked straight into the middle of it. Stop, he said, and something in his tone made both men actually pause. You're arguing about a paragraph that says the opposite of what you both think it says. He took the document from the nearest hand, scanned it once, and began reading it aloud in both languages at the same time, translating on instinct, reconstructing the original intent from memory faster than either lawyer in the room could follow along. He hadn't memorized the contract. He'd simply understood it the first time he'd read it, the way some people understood music or numbers without needing to be taught twice. By the time he finished, both sides were nodding along, tension draining out of their shoulders like air from a punctured tire. No fists thrown. No blood on the marble floor. Just a room full of dangerous men quietly realizing the smartest person in the building had never needed a title to prove it. Not everyone was relieved. A cluster of the same young heirs who'd mocked Kieran earlier watched from near the bar, their expressions tightening instead of softening. Whatever chaos had been building toward tonight, Kieran had just cost someone a great deal of money by stopping it. Rhett watched the whole exchange from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. When Kieran finally stepped back from the negotiating table, their eyes met across the room, and for the first time all evening, Rhett DaCosta looked less like he was calculating a threat and more like a man reconsidering everything he thought he already knew. Later, in his private office down the hall, Rhett opened a folder his head of security had prepared weeks ago, a routine background check on every outside contractor working the gala. He found Kieran Locke's file near the bottom of the stack. Half of it had been redacted. Not the ordinary blank spaces of an incomplete record, but deliberate black lines drawn over specific years, specific addresses, specific names. Someone had gone through Kieran's history and erased entire sections of it long before tonight. Rhett was still staring at the file when the ballroom lights above the chandeliers sputtered, dimmed, and this time didn't come back at all. Screaming broke out immediately this time, and it didn't stop when the emergency lights kicked in along the floor. A gunshot cracked somewhere near the stage, and the crowd scattered in every direction, evening gowns and tailored suits colliding in a stampede of panic. Kieran dropped low on instinct, scanning the chaos the way he trained himself to scan any room, not for the loudest thing happening, but for the thing moving with purpose while everyone else moved out of fear. He found it fast. A man near the north exit, dressed like catering staff, moving against the crowd instead of with it, one hand tucked inside his jacket. Kieran didn't think. He moved. "Get down!" he shouted, and grabbed the nearest shoulder he could reach. It happened to be Rhett's. He yanked hard, throwing both of them sideways behind an overturned banquet table half a second before a second shot cracked through the space where Rhett had been standing. Wood splintered. Glass shattered somewhere above them. For a moment neither man moved, chest heaving. Rhett's arm braced protectively across Kieran without either of them deciding it should be there. "How did you know?" Rhett said low and rough. "Where he'd shoot from?" "I didn't." Kieran's voice shook slightly, adrenaline finally catching up to him. "I knew where you were standing. That was enough." Security swarmed the shooter within seconds, tackling him to the marble floor as more gunfire chipped uselessly into the ceiling. It was over almost as fast as it began, but the room stayed frozen, 500 people staring at the man in the catering uniform now pinned beneath 3 guards. That was when the accusation started. "He knew!" one of the young heirs shouted, pointing directly at Kieran, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "The Omega knew exactly where to pull him. Look how fast he moved. He was in on it." Murmurs spread through the crowd like fire finding dry wood. Fear needed somewhere to go, and Kieran, an outsider, unconnected, unprotected, made an easy target. "He saved my life," Rhett said, but the accusation had already taken root in a dozen suspicious faces. He didn't argue further. He didn't explain, didn't defend, didn't perform outrage for an audience. He simply crossed the ballroom floor, took Kieran gently by the wrist, and pulled him down onto his lap in the nearest chair, in front of every family boss, every heir, every guest still catching their breath. The room went utterly still. "If anyone wishes to accuse him," Rhett said, his voice carrying without needing to rise, "you'll begin by accusing me." Nobody said a word. Nobody dared. Kieran sat rigid for a moment, heart pounding from more than just the gunfire, painfully aware of every eye in the room and the sudden, undeniable warmth of Rhett's arms settling around him like a wall nobody would try to climb. Security dragged the shooter away for questioning. He never made it to a holding room. By the time Rhett's people reached him, he was already dead, a single puncture wound at the base of his neck, the kind that left no time for interrogation, no time for answers. Kieran knelt beside the body before anyone stopped him, studying the dead man's face with the same careful attention he gave everything else. Something familiar tugged at the edge of his memory, though he couldn't place it yet. Then he saw the photograph. Tucked inside the dead man's jacket pocket, worn soft at the edges like it had been carried for years, was a picture of a child. 7, maybe 8 years old. Standing in front of a building Kieran hadn't seen since he was small enough to be carried out of it. The child in the photograph was him. Kieran didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his apartment bed with the photograph's image pulled up on his phone, a picture he'd taken of it before security cleared the body away, because some instinct told him the original would disappear before morning, and he'd been right to trust it. The building in the background was the Riverbend Youth Center. He remembered it the way people remember dreams, in fragments, colors, the smell of industrial cleaner, and the sound of a door that never quite closed all the way. He'd lived there for 2 years before the state moved him again. He hadn't thought about the place in over a decade. Someone had carried his childhood photograph for years. Someone had died with it still in his pocket. That wasn't a coincidence. Kieran didn't believe in those. By morning, he'd pulled every public record he could find on Riverbend. The center had closed 9 years ago, citing funding issues. The official report mentioned relocating 41 children to other facilities across the state. Kieran counted the names in the archived transfer documents. 34. 7 children were simply missing from the paperwork, as if they'd never existed at all. His phone buzzed before he could dig further. An unfamiliar number, a single line of text. "Meet me. Alone. It's about the ledger." He almost ignored it. Almost. But whoever sent it knew about the missing shelter funds, which meant they knew something he needed. The meeting never happened the way he expected. Instead, Rhett DaCosta was waiting outside his apartment building when Kieran stepped out that afternoon, leaning against a car that cost more than most people's homes, looking like a man who hadn't slept either. "You didn't send that text," Kieran said. "No. But I'd like to know who did." Rhett studied him for a long moment. "I want your help auditing the syndicate's finances. All of it. Every account, every donation, every number that doesn't add up." "Why me?" "Because you're the only person in that building last night who wasn't trying to hide something." Rhett's jaw tightened. "And because I think whatever's happening to those missing children runs through my organization, whether I meant for it to or not." Kieran studied him carefully, the way he studied everything, looking for the crack in the story, the detail that didn't fit. He didn't find one. That unsettled him more than if he had. "I don't trust you," Kieran said honestly. "Good." A faint, humorless smile crossed Rhett's face. "Trust me once you've seen I've earned it. Not before." It wasn't the answer Kieran expected from a man used to being obeyed without question. Something about that honesty cracked open a door he'd kept shut for a long time, not trust yet, but the smallest possibility of it. They spent the next 3 days buried in financial records in a locked office on the top floor of Rhett's building, ledgers spread across every surface, numbers that told a story either of them liked. Money moving through shell charities. Donations that vanished between one account and the next. A pattern stretching back nearly a decade, always circling back to youth shelters, always circling back to children who'd simply stopped appearing on paper. Neither man spoke about the moment in the ballroom, the way Rhett's arm had settled around him like something permanent, the way Kieran still felt the ghost of that warmth hours later when he closed his eyes. There were more important fires to put out first. On the third night, Kieran found the missing ledger page. It should have connected 2 shell accounts directly to a name that mattered, someone respected, someone who attended galas like the one that nearly got Rhett killed. But the page had been torn out of the binding so cleanly that only a careful eye would have noticed it was gone at all. He noticed. He said nothing to Rhett yet, unwilling to accuse anyone until he had proof solid enough to survive being questioned. He photographed the empty binding, marked the page number, and went home past midnight with more questions than answers. The missing page was waiting for him the next morning, slid beneath his apartment door in a plain envelope. No note. No name. Kieran stared at it for a long moment before he picked it up, hands steadier than his heartbeat. Someone out there wanted the truth to come out. He just didn't yet know if that person was trying to help him, or setting a trap only smart enough to be sprung once he believed he was safe. The envelope sat unopened on Kieran's kitchen counter for nearly 10 minutes before he found the nerve to touch it again. Inside, the missing ledger page was exactly what he'd hoped and exactly what he'd feared. A single account, routed through 3 shell charities before landing in the name of a man Kieran recognized immediately, not because he'd met him, but because his photograph hung in half the lobbies of every children's welfare office in the city. Desmond Kane, Executive Director of the Lakeside Children's Trust. A man who'd spent 20 years building a reputation as the state's most trusted advocate for foster and abandoned youth. Kieran read the page 4 times before the shape of it settled into something he could actually believe. He called Rhett before he'd finished processing what it meant. "It's not just missing donation money," Kieran said, spreading the page and 3 months of financial records across the same locked office where they'd worked through the night before. "It's guardianship transfers. Adoption placements. Someone's been steering vulnerable kids towards specific families in exchange for payments disguised as charitable gifts." Rhett went very still, the way he did whenever something mattered enough to strip the calm off his face. "Kane. You know him. Everyone knows him. He spoke at my mother's memorial fundraiser." Rhett's jaw tightened. "He sat across from me at a table 3 months ago and asked me to increase my family's contribution to the shelter program. He's been laundering trafficked influence through that exact program for years." Kieran tapped the page. "Not people. Paperwork. guardianships sold to families willing to pay for the right child, inheritance disputes quietly resolved in favor of whoever paid Kane's foundation first. It's elegant. Nobody looks twice at a man everyone already trusts. Rhett picked up an older document from the stack between them, one Kieran hadn't gotten to yet, and went pale in a way Kieran had never seen from him. I signed this, Rhett said quietly. 6 years ago. A donation authorization. Kane brought it to me personally, told me it was funding shelter renovations. He set it down like it had grown heavy in his hands. I didn't read past the summary page. I trusted him because everyone trusted him. You didn't know. That doesn't make it better. Rhett's voice carried none of its usual command, only something rawer underneath. My name is on a document that helped fund this. Whatever this actually is. Kieran watched him for a long moment, surprised by the honesty of it, a man used to being obeyed, admitting fault without being cornered into it first. It didn't erase what the signature meant. But it told Kieran something about the man sitting across from him that mattered more than he wanted to admit. Then help me finish exposing it, Kieran said. All the way to the top. Not just Kane. Everyone who's been protecting him. Rhett didn't hesitate. Whatever you need. They spent the following 2 days building a timeline, cross-referencing guardianship court filings against Kane's foundation donors, mapping a pattern that spread wider than either of them had first believed. Lawyers. A family court judge. 2 officials from the state's child welfare office. All of them connected through Kane's foundation, all of them profiting quietly from a system built to protect the exact children it was exploiting. On the second night, Rhett drove Kieran to the police precinct himself, 3 sealed boxes of evidence in the trunk of his car, ready to hand the entire case to a detective he trusted outside the reach of Kane's influence. They arrived to find the evidence room already cleared out. Not just their boxes. Every existing file connected to the Lakeside Children's Trust, going back a decade, gone overnight without a single record of who authorized it. The detective who met them looked as shaken as they felt. Someone with real authority made this disappear, he said. I don't know who yet. But whoever it is, they moved fast enough to know you were coming before you got here. Kieran felt the floor of his plan crack open beneath him. Someone inside the system Kane had built for years already knew exactly what they had, and exactly how close they'd come to exposing it. Kieran didn't sleep that week. He barely tried. If the physical evidence had been erased, they'd need something Kane couldn't make disappear, a case built entirely from records already public, timestamps nobody could quietly delete, and testimony from people brave enough to speak once the truth had somewhere safe to land. He worked from Rhett's office for 4 straight days, rebuilding everything from scratch using court archives, tax filings, and public adoption records that existed outside any single database Kane's allies could reach. It was slower. It was maddening. But it was untouchable. Rhett stayed beside him through all of it, learning the financial trail as thoroughly as Kieran had, no longer a boss delegating a problem but a partner carrying half its weight. You didn't have to do this, Kieran told him one night, past 2 a.m, the office lit only by desk lamps and the glow of 3 laptop screens. Neither did you. Rhett didn't look up from the ledger in his hands. You could have taken that first ledger page straight to Kane and sold your silence for more money than either of us has counted tonight. Instead you're sitting in my office at 2 a.m. rebuilding a case someone tried to bury, for kids you've never met. I have met them, Kieran said quietly. I was one of them. Rhett looked up then, and something passed between them that neither man tried to name out loud. By the end of the week, they had enough. Not everything. But enough to force Kane into a room where he couldn't simply pay his way out. That was when the frame began. It started small, a rumor at a business dinner that Kieran had padded expense reports during his contract work for the gala. Then a formal complaint, filed by someone inside Kane's foundation, claiming Kieran had solicited a bribe in exchange for altering translated contracts. Then, worse, a forged wire transfer record showing $50,000 moving from a shelter account into Kieran's name. None of it was true. All of it looked convincing enough to matter. Within 72 hours, Kieran went from an anonymous interpreter to the public face of the very corruption he'd uncovered, his name printed in a financial fraud complaint that painted him as the architect instead of the witness. Even Rhett, staring at the fabricated wire transfer late one night, allowed himself one unguarded moment of doubt. "Tell me this isn't real," he said, sliding the document across the desk. "It isn't," Kieran said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "But I understand why you had to ask." Rhett studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, the doubt gone as quickly as it had surfaced. "Then we prove it isn't." But Kieran had a different plan, one that made Rhett's jaw tighten the moment he heard it. "I'm not going to fight this quietly," Kieran said. "If I defend myself now, in private, Kane buries the real story under my name and walks away clean. I want the accusation to spread. I want him confident enough to think he's already won. That's a risk that could end your career. Your freedom. It's a risk that ends his," Kieran said. "Everything I need to prove my innocence is the same evidence that proves his guilt. But it only works if he believes I'm cornered." Rhett didn't like it. Kieran could see that clearly in the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands curled slightly against the desk. But he didn't argue further. 2 days later, formal charges were filed. Kieran Locke, accused of financial fraud against a children's charity, ordered to appear before a review board that included 3 people whose names appeared quietly, deliberately, inside Kane's donor records. Kieran walked into the precinct that morning and turned himself involuntarily, before anyone came looking for him. The hearing room filled faster than Kieran expected, word of the accusation having spread through exactly the circles he'd hoped it would. Desmond Kane sat near the front, composed, dressed in the kind of understated suit that photographed well for charity galas, his expression carrying just the right amount of disappointed concern. A man who had spent 20 years learning how to look trustworthy in front of a room. Rhett sat 2 rows back, close enough to be present, far enough to avoid the appearance of influencing the proceedings. Kieran had insisted on that distance. This needed to look like justice working on its own, not a mafia boss protecting an interest. The board's lead investigator opened with the fabricated wire transfer, laying out the accusation in careful, damning language. Kieran didn't panic. He'd been preparing for this exact moment for 4 sleepless days. "I'd like to walk the board through the timestamp on that transfer," he said, standing without waiting to be invited. "The transaction is dated 3 days before I was ever granted access to any shelter account. I didn't have login credentials for that system until the day after this transfer allegedly occurred. That's not an opinion. That's in the access logs, which I've also provided the board, pulled directly from the charity's own security system." A murmur moved through the room. He continued, methodical and unshaken, laying out timestamp after timestamp, cross-referencing every accusation against records that existed independent of anything Kane's people could quietly erase. Each piece dismantled another thread of the fabricated case, until what remained wasn't a fraud complaint at all, but a timeline pointing directly back toward the Lakeside Children's Trust itself. "The real discrepancy," Kieran said, sliding a final folder across the table, "isn't $50,000 moved into an account that didn't exist yet. It's $4 million moved out of shelter funding over 3 years, routed through accounts connected to guardianship placements that were never disclosed to the families involved." Kane's composure cracked for the first time, a flicker of something sharper than concern crossing his face before he smoothed it away. "This is a desperate attempt to distract from his own. Show them the account you used to pay my accuser," Kieran said quietly, "or I will." The room went silent. Rhett rose from his seat then, and every head turned. He hadn't planned to speak. But watching Kieran stand alone in front of a room built to condemn him, something in Rhett refused to stay seated any longer. I signed a donation authorization 6 years ago that helped fund part of this, Rhett said, his voice steady despite the admission costing him more than most people in that room would ever understand. I didn't know what it was funding. That failure is mine. I should have asked more questions before I trusted a man because everyone else did. He looked directly at Kane. I'm done making that mistake. The board members exchanged glances. Whatever confidence Kane had walked in with was gone now, replaced by the particular stillness of a man watching his own trap close around him instead. This changes nothing, Kane said, though his voice had lost its certainty. It changes everything, Kieran said. Because I'm not the only one who found the money. He nodded toward the back of the room, where a woman in a gray coat stood quietly near the door. A former Lakeside caseworker who'd contacted Kieran 2 nights earlier, terrified but ready to talk, after seeing her own name buried in Kane's falsified guardianship files. The board called a recess before Kane could say another word. In the hallway outside, as reporters who'd caught wind of the hearing began gathering by the courthouse steps, a lone figure near the back of the crowd began clapping, slow and deliberate, before disappearing into the crowd before anyone could get a clear look at his face. The recess lasted 3 hours, and by the time the board reconvened, the story had already broken across every local news outlet in the city. Kane's lawyer requested a private settlement before the hearing resumed. The board refused. Too many reporters. Too many cameras. Too much evidence already sitting in the public record for anyone to quietly make it disappear the way the police file had vanished weeks earlier. By the following afternoon, investigators had traced the fabricated wire transfer and the false accusation directly to a junior associate inside Kane's foundation, one who'd been promised a partnership in exchange for helping bury the truth. The associate didn't protect Kane for long once prosecutors offered him a deal instead of a cell. The full picture emerged over the following days, uglier and wider than even Kieran had expected. Kane hadn't acted alone. A family court judge, 2 state welfare officials, and a network of adoption attorneys had spent nearly a decade steering guardianships toward families willing to pay for them, quietly manipulating inheritance disputes and adoption placements in exchange for donations laundered through the very foundation meant to protect the children caught in the middle. 7 children from Riverbend hadn't simply vanished from the transfer paperwork. They'd been placed, quietly and illegally, with families who'd paid Kane's foundation directly for the privilege, their original records sealed and falsified to hide the transaction entirely. Kieran read every name in that final report. He recognized none of them. But he understood every one of them better than anyone else in that courthouse ever could. Kane was arrested 2 days later, escorted out of his own foundation's headquarters in handcuffs while reporters recorded every step. The judge and both welfare officials followed within the week, their careers dismantled by the same paper trail Kieran had spent a decade unknowingly qualifying himself to uncover. Rhett found Kieran that evening on the rooftop of his building, staring out over a city that finally felt less like a place that had failed him and more like one he might have actually helped. "You could have taken revenge," Rhett said, standing beside him at the railing. "Kane destroyed part of your childhood. You had every right to want him ruined publicly, personally, permanently. He is ruined," Kieran said. "But revenge ends with me feeling something for about a week and then feeling nothing at all. This ends with oversight requirements written into every guardianship placement in the state. Independent audits on every foundation handling shelter funding. A scholarship program funded by Kane's seized assets, specifically for kids aging out of the system he exploited." He looked over at Rhett. "That doesn't just punish what he did. It makes it harder for the next version of him to try." Rhett studied him for a long moment, something unguarded settling into his expression. "I used to think strength meant making sure nobody could hurt you again," Watching you this week, I understood it means something different for you. What's that? Making sure nobody else gets hurt the same way. Rhett's voice dropped, quieter now, more honest than Kieran had ever heard him. I stopped thinking about protecting my reputation somewhere around the second night we spent going through those ledgers. I started thinking about protecting people instead. You did that. Not the evidence. You. Kieran didn't have a response ready for that, which surprised him more than anything Kane had thrown at him all week. Rhett didn't push for one. He simply stood there beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, asking for nothing beyond that quiet, steady presence. Stay, Rhett said finally. Not as an employee. Not as a favor. Just stay. Kieran looked out at the skyline for a long moment, feeling the weight of the question settle somewhere he hadn't expected to let anyone reach. He didn't answer. 3 months later, the Riverbend building reopened under a different name, funded in part by a scholarship program carrying no acknowledgement of the man whose downfall had made it possible, and no acknowledgement of the man whose testimony had made it necessary either. Kieran had insisted on that. This was never supposed to be about credit. 2 of the 7 missing children from the falsified transfer records had been found, both grown now, both finally given access to the truth about the years someone had erased from their files. A 3rd case remained open, a trail Kieran still checked on some nights out of habit more than obligation. He hadn't joined Rhett's organization. He'd made that clear from the first week after the hearing ended, and Rhett, true to the promise he'd made on that rooftop, never asked twice. Instead, Kieran built something of his own, a small consulting practice advising nonprofits and family courts on financial oversight, the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that made it considerably harder for the next Desmond Kane to hide in plain sight. Rhett found him on a Tuesday evening outside his new office, waiting without the usual weight of authority hanging off his shoulders, dressed like a man who'd come simply to see him rather than to be seen. I'm not here to ask you to stay again, Rhett said. I already asked once. You don't owe me an answer just because time passed. I know. Kieran studied him, noticing how much had shifted in 3 months, not in what Rhett controlled, but in how he carried it. Quieter. Steadier. Less like a man defending an empire and more like one who'd finally decided what that empire should be for. Ask me something else instead. Rhett almost smiled. Dinner. Tonight. No audits. No ledgers. Just dinner. Kieran considered it for exactly as long as it took to realize he already wanted to say yes. If you ever choose to walk beside me, Rhett added quietly, before Kieran could answer, I want it to be because you want to. Not because you need to. Not because you owe anyone anything. I learned that the hard way, watching you refuse every kind of ownership anyone tried to offer you your whole life. Kieran smiled, something unguarded finally reaching his eyes. Then yes. Dinner. A pause. We'll see about the rest. They walked together down a street neither of them needed protection to cross anymore, the city around them ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way Kieran had spent his whole life wishing for. His phone buzzed once in his pocket as they reached the corner. An encrypted file, sender unknown, no explanation attached. He almost ignored it, the way he'd learned to ignore most things that arrived without context. Then he opened it anyway. A photograph. 2 people he hadn't seen since he was small enough to forget their faces without a picture to hold on to. Dated years after the state had told him they were gone. He stared at it for a long moment, the noise of the street fading around him.